Okay, we're in area 1A, and of course we're going to be going through areas 1 through 7 that come up on the exam. So this one is property ownership and land use and controls and regulations. And so let's go ahead and get started on this. And we have, first thing we have is something called property. Okay, so property is an owner's rights and interests in the thing owned. Okay, and that's the terminology that they were using on the exam. And so property, of course, remember, is going to be either personal property or real property. And of course, property has a bundle of rights that go with it. Those rights are to use it, possess it, enjoy it, transfer, or dispose of a thing. So we're talking about real property, like a house maybe that you're handling a client's purchase of that property. They're going to be able to use it as a home, possess it, and hopefully it won't be possessed, right? Or repossessed. And enjoy, right? Enjoy it. They can also transfer it by using a deed to sell it, or they could will it, or they could gift it, or they dispose of the thing. We're not really sure what disposing of the house would be, but anyway, that's those bundle of rights that go with property. Now, there are two types of property. There is real property and personal property. Real property is usually immovable. It doesn't move. It's like a house. And personal property is something that moves. Okay, moves, like we use, keys. Anything that's movable is going to be personal property, and if it's immovable, it's going to be considered usually real property. And based on that, ownership of real property circle is legally and technically defined as rights, interests in the thing owned. Okay, so that's real property right there. And so just circle is. Legally and technically, property is defined as circle A is now for the rights, interests which a person has in the thing owned. Now, this is what the practice questions look like here, which are similar to what is on the exam. Okay, and so now you see a little bit how that works. Okay, and then let's go to real property differs from personal property. And that real property is any item that is immovable by law. So if it's immovable, it's real property. If it's movable, it's personal property, and that's how that works. Now, real property is, we're going to talk a lot about real property because it's called real estate. We'll also talk a little bit about personal property because you have to know that as well on the exam. So, but right now we're talking about real property, and that's the land. It's anything that's affixed to the land and anything that is appurtenant to the land. We're going to go through each one of these specifically and explain how they work. Okay, the first one we're going to talk about is the land, okay? And see if you can find a spot to draw there. Let's go ahead and give here's the earth. Okay, this is the earth, and the land is going to be the surface area right here. That's the surface area. It's also going to include, which a lot of people don't know, is this invert pie shape type thing down to the center of the earth, which includes unmined minerals and things like gold that'll be in this thing. You would actually own that, unless those mineral rights were reserved by someone else, right? You would actually own the surface area, all this area underneath, and right, the airspace up above as much as you can reasonably use. Like maybe you put an antenna up or something. But you can't go too high because the airways for the flights for the airplanes, okay, that has the jurisdiction up here, but you're going to have some reasonable use. That's going to be the land, okay? And that land is going to include unmined minerals. It's going to include soil, okay? So this is, of course, soil that's in here. It's going to include vegetation, okay? And we're going to talk about that in just a second, which will be attached by a root system. And it'll also include a stream, okay? So a stream running through it would also be included as real property. Okay, so that's going to be a good idea of what the land is. Okay, so now we understand the land. Let's look at, what about we put a house on the land? So let's look at the second thing, anything that's affixed to the land. Okay, so let's put our house up here. And this house, okay, is our house. Okay, now the house is attached by a foundation to the land, so it would be considered real property. Okay, so that's a pretty good indication of something that is going to be real property. Now, a mobile home that sits on wheels and moves, right, that's personal property. But if that mobile home was attached down to a foundation, it would be real property. In this case, this is a house that's sitting with the foundation. It's going to be considered real property. Okay, so that's going to be fairly easy looking at a house, okay, figuring the house out. Now, what about something called a fixture? Okay, now a fixture is something that is something that's incorporated into the land and it becomes real property. So let's use a satellite dish like we have in the picture there, a great big huge satellite dish. I'm going to put it right here. And say you have this huge satellite dish that goes like this, and it's attached by concrete, right? Concrete into the ground. So what we're looking at this thinking, you know what? That's probably going to be real property because it's attached by concrete. Okay, and that's what we call a fixture. Another thing you see in the picture there would be kitchen cabinets. When they're on the truck, when you're bringing them in, they're personal property because they move. Once you bolt them down to the house, they become real property and they become a fixture. You may have heard the term light fixtures. Well, it's the same thing. Light fixture is when it's in the box, it's personal property. Once it is attached to the home, it is considered real property. One of the problems with fixtures you're going to run into when you're out doing transactional work is the difference between real and personal property. You may have an heirloom chandelier that's sitting in the room. You know the seller is going to take that with him, but it is attached to the house, so it's actually real property. So what you have to do is you have to be very careful with that and to make sure that the buyer knows that that's not going to be going with the property. Okay, so how we do that, we have some tests for a fixture. And we use the acronym MARIA to remember this. Okay, so it's method of attachment. In this case, on this one here, it's concrete, so that's a pretty good indication. It probably is a fixture and it is real property. Adaptability or annexation, like a set of keys to the property might actually become real property if it fits the lock and goes with the house. Okay, so that's not going to be much help here. Relationship of the parties, buyer-seller. Okay, buyer-seller is an adversarial relationship, right? So that's not going to help us much either. Intent of the parties, that is the big one. The big one is the intent. What is the intent? Well, on this particular property right here, I sold this property a few years ago, and my sellers thought that it was personal property and they could take it with them. The buyers thought that it was real property, that it was going to stay there with the property. So they had a conflict of intent. So that left the agreement. Now the agreement, in the purchase agreement, I should have specified whether this satellite dish was real or personal property. Okay, but remember, you have to make a visual inspection of all accessible areas. And I went around and looked at all the accessible areas, but I did not notice the satellite dish that was attached to the concrete in the backyard. Okay, it's one of those great big ones that has thousands of channels, you know. And so I messed up on that one. And fortunately, the buyers did a pretty good deal on that one. But what happened was my sellers took this off to the new house, and it's still there. Okay, so they moved it with them. And so in the agreement, I should have specified whether this was real or personal property. Didn't do so, and that can be a real problem. So we use Maria and to figure out whether an item is a fixture and is therefore real property. So we use that. Now remember, of course, time and cost are not tests for a fixture. When you put it in and how much it costs does not matter. Only Maria is what we use. Okay, so that's a pretty good thing to know when you're dealing with the fixtures. And so when cabinets are permanently attached to a home, the cabinets become real property because they are, like you're right, incorporated into the land, and they become real property. And again, there's a picture of a house with attached cabinets, which would be, again, if they're on the truck out there, they're moving their personal property. Once they go into the house, they're bolted to the wall, right? They're going to be attached and they're considered real property. Look at this practice question. The following is real property. I'd like you to circle B as in boy, a bearing wall in a single family dwelling. Okay, so what is a bearing wall in a single family dwelling? Well, this is a wall that's going to hold the house up. So it'll be this one right here, and this one right here will be considered bearing walls. And are they real property? Yeah, it's a part of the house. The house is attached by a foundation system to the land, and it's real property. Then we have another thing called emblements. Okay, emblements. Now, emblements include planted trees, vegetation, and trees in nature. And let's go ahead and give an example here real quickly. Let's say that we have a planted tree, like an apple tree. Now, if we have an apple tree, and it's sitting right here, that is attached by a root system and is considered real property. Okay, vegetation, okay, which might be a bush, you know. So we have some vegetation. Let's put some vegetation in here. Okay, so here's vegetation. Is it attached by a root system? Yes. So is it therefore real property? Yes, it is. But trees in nature, like a huge ponderosa pine tree, right? And this tree in nature is attached by a root system. So it's a great big tree, right? And it's attached by a root system. It's going to be considered real property. Now, when you cut it down, you sever it, and that ponderosa pine tree becomes a log. The log moves, so it's going to be personal property. But when it's attached by a root system, it's considered real property. Okay? And of course, remember the planted trees we talked about are going to be like an apple tree. And I'm going to bring that one back. We got the vegetation down already, so now let's look at this apple tree. Okay? Now we have an apple tree. Apples are on the tree, real property. It's attached by a root system. The apples on the tree are attached to this tree, real property, real easy. Now, what happens if the owner of that apple orchard and that tree right there decides to sell the entire apple crop to a buyer? Well, when that apple crop has been sold to the buyer, those apples on that tree that are still attached to it are considered personal property. Okay, and I like to ask that on the exam. Okay, so remember, if you're just looking at the tree with the apple crop, it's real property. But if that crop has been sold, right, it's been sold, then the apples are going to be considered personal property. So be really careful with that one. Okay, and that's really important. Of course, then we also have vegetation, which we had already talked about a little bit. That'd be like bushes and things. They'll love to ask that on the exam. And trees in nature, like the ponderosa pine tree. And which of the following would normally be considered real property? Well, circle C as in Charlie, that's going to be vegetation. Right, vegetation. So that's a pretty easy one. And the other three ones, the trade fixtures we're going to cover in just a little bit, are considered personal property. Chattels, anytime you see the word chattel, that's going to be personal property. And deeds of trust, that's of course what we use for loans. It's a piece of paper that moves, so it's going to be personal property as well. Okay, and what is real property? Circle C as in Charlie, soil, vegetation, and a stream. We've already seen those already. Real property includes, C as in Charlie, vegetation. Notice how there are multiple variations of each question. So if you try to memorize these things, it doesn't work. You got to know it, because if you don't know it, you will not pass the exam, right? Again, memorization is set up so that if you do memorize it, you won't pass the exam without actually knowing the stuff. Okay, so Abel owned a farm where he's growing corn. So let's put some corn up here. Okay, so here's our corn. Got corn crop right there. Okay. Before he harvests the corn, he sold the property to Baker. Okay, so the corn is still on the stalks. He intended to harvest the corn after the sale, however, did not state this intention in the purchase agreement. Big mistake. Therefore, the corn, circle, would transfer to Baker as real property. Okay, so would transfer. So when this corn is on the stalk, it would transfer to Baker. Baker may have actually paid more money for this property because of the corn crop that was on there. Okay, so what Abel should have done is he should have specified that the corn crop does not go with it, or he should have harvested the corn before he put the property on the market. He didn't either, so it would actually transfer to Baker. Now remember, if that corn crop had been sold to someone else, just the corn crop itself had been sold, just like our apples we talked about, the corn crop had been sold, that corn crop is considered personal property. But it hadn't been sold in this particular question, so it would transfer as real property. So they're going to try to kind of confuse you a little bit on that one, so just be very careful and read those questions carefully on this. Okay, so an unpicked fruit crop is considered real property. Okay, so it's unpicked fruit crop. In this case, we have our apple trees. We'll bring that back again a little bit. So here's our apple tree again, right? And the apples are on the trees is actually going to be considered real property because it not saying anything about being sold. It just says unpicked fruit crop. It's considered real property. Yeah, because it's attached to the tree and it's considered real property. But remember, if you sell the fruit crop, which doesn't mention anything in this particular question we're referencing here, then you sell it, it's going to become personal property. So look at the next one here. Sold. An unpicked fruit crop that has been sold is considered personal property. Okay, so be very, very careful with that, because that is what they'll get you on the exam. So just remember, if it's been sold, it's personal property. If they don't say anything about being sold, it's real property. Okay, and so I think we got that one down pretty well. Now let's go ahead and head over to number 3. We have talked about the land. Right, we're going to talk about the land. Anything that's affixed to the land. Now we're going to talk about anything that is appurtenant to the land, which means runs with the land. Okay, and so this is going to be anything that's appurtenant. Let's go ahead and put it up here. Here we go. Anything that's appurtenant which runs with the land. There's 3 things that come up on the exam on this thing. First thing we have is called an easement, which we're going to be talking about in a second. We have easements. Then we have something called CC&Rs. They use covenants, conditions, and restrictions. We're going to cover that. And then we have water company stock, or stock in a mutual water company. And so it actually, those are the 3 that we have that come up. So let's go ahead and talk about these. And first of all, an appurtenance runs with the land and is considered real property. Now, runs with the land, of course, is anything that goes with it. And easements, water company stock, and CC&Rs are the 3 things that we see come up on the exam. So let's look at easements first of all. And there's a spot right there. Go ahead and write easements in there. And an easement, how that works is, and you can see this here, we're going to do this, it's called an appurtenant easement. We're going to cover this really extensively in Area 1B. But just quickly to show you what an appurtenant easement is. So let's say that we have a guy who has a house right here, the big lot in the back. What he does is he subdivides it into 2, builds another house in the back, and then he allows that person to drive over his property out to the road. Okay? So this person has the ability to drive over his property out to the road. It's called an easement. So the actual driveway that he has is not the easement. The easement is the ability of this owner to actually drive over this property here out to the road. Okay, so that's what they allow this to do. So what happens is it's going to be appurtenant to this parcel right here. So whoever owns this parcel can drive over this one out to the road. There's some names we're going to give you that in Area 1B, but for this point right here, we just want to realize that it's appurtenant to this parcel right here. So whoever owns this can drive over. So this person owns it and sells the property. Whoever buys it, they can drive over this property out to the road. Okay, so it runs with the land. So this seller who sells it can't take off with it. It'll always stay with the property. It's called an appurtenant easement, and again, we'll be talking about that later. Then also we have water company stock, or stock in a mutual water company. And so water company stock, or stock in a mutual water company. And how this works is, let's say that we have some properties around here, and here's a subject property that we have. And here's the mutual water company. Okay, the mutual water company, let's put mutual in there so you remember it. Okay, company is right here. So what happens is that each owner, if you own this property right here, you would own 1 share of stock in a mutual water company. So that means you're allocated a certain amount of water from the water company to use for your property. Now, when you sell that property, you cannot run off with this, can't take it with you. Whoever buys the property is going to have the 1 share of stock in the mutual water company, can use that much water. Okay, so that's going to be our second one we have there. And so stock in a mutual water company, circle C as in Charlie, is appurtenant to the land and thus automatically transfers to the buyer. Okay, so it runs with the land. So that's a pretty good thing to know on that, right? And then which of the following is considered real property? And be careful here, don't circle anything yet, because remember, which of the following is considered real property? Rights of the mutual water company, is that real property? Yes. But what about B, unpicked fruit crop? Is that real property? Yes, because remember, it doesn't say anything about being sold. And unmined minerals like the gold and things in the ground, right? That's going to be considered real property as well. So the correct answer is D, all the above. You're going to see a lot of questions excuse me, where A is the right answer on one question and D is the right answer on another. So you got to be very careful. When you see the A answer, go look at the B and C. Make sure it's not D and all the above, because that can be if you go too fast, that can happen. Okay, and then another thing we have is something called a covenant. Go ahead and write that in there where it says covenant, and it stands for CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. We're going to be covering this in depth in Area 1B, but I want to cover this now so you understand that this is something that runs with the land. So CC&Rs will be with this property. What it does is the covenants is a breach. If you breach a covenant, it's a minor breach remedied by monetary damages. It's a breach of a promise. So the first C in that is just a breach of a promise. The second C is a condition, which results in loss of title if you violate that one. That's a big one. And then we have private deed restrictions, which is the R. And of course, that affects the use of the property. And we're going to give you some specific examples, but what we're talking about here is a breach of a covenant might be that you've parked your car out in the front yard too long or something. Sometimes they have very, very tight CC&Rs, and the homeowner association may tow the car and send you the bill. Okay, so that's a breach of a covenant. Then a condition is, say you have a really tight architectural control committee and you put a second floor onto your ranch style home and you paint it yellow. They of course will then use the CC&Rs to force you to move it back to the way it was before, and to a ranch style single story home, or they'll actually force you to sell the property to them and they'll replace it and move it back to the way it was, because it of course reduced the value of all the homes around it. So that would be a condition, which is much more stringent than a covenant because it results in loss of title. And then the R, which is a private deed restriction, that would be something like you burning rubbish in the backyard, and so they'll go to the court and get the homeowner association will get the court to issue an injunction, stop you from burning rubbish in the backyard. Okay, so that's a private deed restriction. And so again, we're going to see those a little bit more, spend a little more time on them in Area 1B. Okay, let's look at some these right here with personal property. And the principal difference between real property and personal property is mobility. Yeah, if it moves, it's probably personal property. If it doesn't, it's probably real property. Okay, and based on that, the ownership of personal property is transferred using a bill of sale. So we use a bill of sale to transfer personal property. So if you have some refrigerator, something that moves that maybe might be going from the seller to the buyer, you can use a bill of sale if you want to transfer any types of personal property. And with real estate, what we use is something called a grant deed to transfer transfer real property in California is a grant deed, or we use a quitclaim deed to remove someone from title. But for the personal property, we use the bill of sale. Okay, so we'll be talking about the real property, the deeds in Area 5A, so you'll know lots about deeds. Okay, and the ownership of personal property is transferred with, circle D as in David, a bill of sale. Okay, so we use deeds to transfer real property, we use a bill of sale to transfer personal property. Now, what about a loan secured by personal property? Okay, the instrument used to secure a loan on personal property is called, let me write, security agreement. And so we use a security agreement if there's a loan on personal property. Now, if there's a loan on real property, we're going to use something called a deed of trust or trust deed, which we'll be seeing in Area 4B. So you'll know lots about that as well for real estate. But for personal property, it's the security agreement. Okay, and regarding a mortgage on personal property, what can one do with it? Well, you can alienate, hypothecate, or assess. I like to ask this question. It's kind of a far out question, but you'll know the answer to it is the good news. So if you see this, to alienate means to sell or convey. Hypothecate is place as collateral for a loan, and assess means to tax it. So if you see that particular question, go for D, all the above. Okay, so alienate is to sell or convey. It's the opposite of acquisition, right? Which is acquire, right? And to sell or convey is to sell it. That's to alienate is to sell or convey. Hypothecate, place as collateral for a loan, and then assess, which is tax it. So to go for D, all the above, you're on with your real estate career on that particular question. And under the Uniform Commercial Code, the document used to mortgage personal property is a security agreement. And so circle D as in David, security agreement. What is the Uniform Commercial Code is designed for business-to-business transactions between merchants. And it sets a code of how they are going to do business. And so according to that, if you're going to put a loan on personal property, they use the term mortgage. And mortgage is what we call a loan. And we're talking about mortgages and deeds of trust in area 4B, but just remember when you see mortgage, it's going to be a loan. So a loan on personal property, security agreement. Okay, and then which of the following would be considered a personal property interest? Well, C as in Charlie, leasehold. Okay, and that one circle, C as in Charlie, leasehold. So stock in a mutual water company, that would not be personal property because that's real property. We knew that because it's appurtenant and runs with the land. Mineral rights, that's in the soil down there, remember, the mineral rights, those are part of the land as well. It's real property. Trees planted in nature, like a ponderosa pine tree attached by a root system, real property. So the only one that could be is a leasehold. Now, we haven't covered leasehold yet. We're going to be doing that very shortly here. And what a leasehold is, that's what a tenant has. And it's evidenced by a lease agreement that moves. So you have a lease agreement that moves, you know, it's a piece of paper. That's going to be personal property. That's how you remember that. Okay, now we do have to understand something a little bit about mobile homes since we're dealing with personal property. Remember, a mobile home that sits on wheels is personal property. And can we sell those things? Yes, we can as real estate professionals. These will be in a mobile home park. We can sell them. And when can we do that? Well, what kind of mobile home can a salesperson or broker sell? Right? B as in boy, a registered mobile home with the California Department of Housing and Community Development. So if it's been registered with the California Department of Housing and Community Development, then we can sell it. That means it's been, you know, registered. Now, if it doesn't have this, it's probably brand new, and we cannot sell brand new mobile homes. We have to have a mobile home dealer's license to do that. But if it has been registered, then we can sell it. So we sell these in mobile home parks all the time, even though they are considered personal property. And in order to sell a mobile home, an agent, circle C as in Charlie, both A and B are correct, must have a mobile home dealer's license. That's, of course, if it's not registered, or must have a real estate license. And the real estate license, we can sell it if it's already been registered. Yeah, mobile home dealers can sell both of them, but as real estate professionals, we can only sell the ones that are have been registered, they're existing, and usually sitting in a mobile home park. And let's look at these two things. Mobile home dealer's license, mobile home broker's license. So mobile home dealer's license, new or used, and a real estate broker's license, which of course, remember, if you're a salesperson, you're working under that broker. Okay, we haven't covered that yet. We're going to cover that in area 2, okay? So salespersons work under brokers. That's going to be talking about you. Okay, mobile home registered with California Department of Housing and Community Development. So just what we just mentioned. And an agent or licensee is able to sell which of the following? And the answer is going to be D as in David, any new mobile home sold with a deed. So in actually a little bit of conflict with what we just said there. If it's a new mobile home, but it is sitting on a parcel of land that has a deed, okay, then you can sell that one as well. See, so I'm going to try to trick you a little bit on that one. So a new mobile home in a mobile home park, you cannot sell because it has not been registered, right? But the thing is that if you are selling some acreage, and I sold one that had 5 acres and it had a mobile home on it, brand new one, and could I sell that with my real estate license, my broker's license? Yes, I could. So just be real careful with that one. So it's a new mobile home, but if it goes with the deed, then you can do it. If it isn't going with the deed, you can't sell that new one until it's registered. So that's another thing that'll try to mess with you a little bit on that. And real estate agent handles the sale of a personal property mobile home. Licensee must notify local Department of Housing and Community Development in writing of the transfer within B as in boy 10 calendar days. A piece of very obscure information, very obscure, but just something 10 calendar days to know if you see it on the exam. You're never going to be doing this because your escrow officer who you're going to be using is going to do it for you. But anyway, this is something that comes up. Now we have another thing that's called trade fixtures. Okay, now trade fixtures are personal property. Now remember we use the word fixture, and a fixture is something that is attached to the land, is incorporated into the land, becomes real property. Well, a trade fixture is an exception to that rule. Okay, a trade fixture, even though it says the word fixture in it, right, is personal property. Here's an example. Let's say that you have a convenience store that you are selling for the client. And the client is moving this convenience store somewhere else. They can actually move it out of the building. So that convenience store that moves, right, may have some shelves, these losier metal shelves that are bolted to the wall. Now, they're bolted to the wall, but because they're being used in the course of trade, right, and they're going to be used by the business, they are, even though they're bolted to the wall, they're considered trade fixtures and personal property. So you can unbolt them from the wall and you can take them with you. Okay, that's a big thing. Now, if you're transferring the actual property to a buyer and it's not moving, you still got an issue to deal with there, because if it's still bolted to the wall and the buyer's buying it, how do you transfer those trade fixtures? Right, with a bill of sale. Yeah, with the bill of sale, because it's considered personal property even though it's bolted to the wall. Okay, so these shelves, if the tenant leaves, you can take them with you because they're personal property even though they're bolted to the wall. Or if you sell the business to a new buyer, you'd have to use a bill of sale to transfer these fixtures to the buyer, even though they're bolted to the wall. They're considered personal property. So this is an exception to the rule. So a bill of sale transfers trade fixtures because they are personal property. So be very careful with this one too. You notice how you have a few things in here that are a little bit illogical, because remember, the exam is not going to be logical at all. It's going to be illogical. And so you have to make sure you know all the little tricks here, and this is another one, right, that you need to understand. So what a fixture is versus a trade fixture, they're different. Then we have something called business opportunities, and you can actually sell a business opportunity with a real estate license. And there's something called the DBA, which means doing business as. Okay, the DBA, it's also called a fictitious business name. So if you say, what's your DBA? Well, you have this fictitious business name that has to be filed in the county where the business is located. And so, ABC Real Estate or whatever the business might be. What'll happen is you have to get this fictitious business name, has to be registered in that particular county, and you have to publish the notice of the sale. And it doesn't cost too much money to do that, though. Then we have corporations. Now, a corporation can go ahead and do business, and if they have a fictitious business name, they're going to also have to file that as well. But remember, a fictitious person is someone that's a figment of your imagination. It doesn't have anything to do with fictitious business names. So they may try to confuse you between fictitious business name and fictitious person, so don't fall into that one. Fictitious person is someone that doesn't exist, except in somebody's mind, right? And fictitious business name, that's, of course, the name that you're using to do business as in that particular county. So that's a pretty good indication of how that works. So anyway, if a real estate brokerage obtains a fictitious business name, its circle must file the name with the county recorder in the county where the property is located, publish the fictitious business name in the newspaper of general circulation. And I think the last time I did those it was about 4 weeks, once a week for 4 weeks, and then you can get that fairly cheaply done in a newspaper specialized in doing that. And then, of course, obtain approval of the name by the real estate commissioner and issue a new real estate license, the new name of the fictitious business name. So if you have a real estate company and you are, of course, going to be doing business as, you have to do all three of those things. You have to register it in the county, you have to publish it, right? And then you also have to go to the real estate commissioner and make sure that that business name is going to be okay. Because if that name is something that sounds real similar to like a large lender or something like some bank, you can't do that. You have to make sure that it's a unique name that's not going to get you in trouble. And so they'll have to, of course, issue a new license in that name for you. And that is really important to do that, because if you don't, you could lose your license and get fined and all kinds of bad things by the Bureau of Real Estate. Okay, so that's going to be a pretty good indication of how that works. Okay, so that's business opportunities, and so I think we understand those a little bit, and we're going to be heading on over to estates and land. Now let's talk about some of the estates in land. Okay, and there's two different types, and so what you can do is you can draw a line right down the middle of the page if you'd like, and go ahead and put right here, line right down the middle of the page. On the left side, we'd like you to put freehold estates. Okay, and then on the right side, we'd like you to put leasehold estates. Which are also called less than freehold estates. Okay, and what happens is that they call it leasehold estate and less than freehold. They use both of them on the exam, so they're the same things. Just have to know both of them. Okay, now this is an example for freehold and less than freehold leasehold estates. Two examples. One of them was, there's a movie, matter of fact, a really good movie called Braveheart that I think Mel Gibson was in, really. And if you remember that, if you ever had to see that movie, when you're dealing with the king and all the kings, the people who have pledged their allegiance to the king, what happens is they own the land in the freehold. This is where this actually came from, over in Old England. And so all those people that the king favors, because they pledged their allegiance to the king, would actually own the land, as freehold estates. All the people getting killed in the movie, those are those tenant farmers or serfs, they call them. And what happens is they would have just possession of it. There would be tenant farmers. They'd actually be tilling the ground or planting crops, for example, and they would actually just have possession. Okay, so the highest form of ownership was the freehold. Now that's the example we use from a historical standpoint, but for today's standpoint, there's a much easier one to look at. Let's put this right here just because it happens to fit. Okay, so here's what we have: an apartment building. Okay, this is an apartment building, and with the apartment building, you're going to have the land, right? Everything affixed to it, which of course would be the building, and all the appurtenances which run with the land. And those appurtenances that run with the land are going to be, CC&Rs, and in our specific situation, water company stock, easements, pertinent easements, things like that. They're going to run with the land. So this is going to be an apartment building, and so the landlord, right, who holds the freehold estate, right, the landlord who holds the freehold estate, right, he's going to own the land, everything fixed to it, and all the appurtenances, and that's going to be considered real property. Okay, so that's what the landlord's going to have, is going to be this, and that's going to be the freehold estate. Okay, so that's what the owner is in today's world. Okay, so they're going to own the freehold estate. This is the one you want to own, right? Now the tenant is going to have the leasehold or less than freehold. I'll put leasehold in here. Estate. Now it's not much of an estate in land. All it is a possession of this space for a very short period of time. Okay, so the thing is that you have these two different estates in land, and that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so the freehold estate, which is going to be over here, is what the landlord owns. The one who owns the land, the building, all the appurtenances, they own that. Now, what they can do is they can actually give this freehold estate, less than freehold estate or leasehold estate, so here, right, to a tenant if they will pay them rent. So the tenant gets this leasehold estate, occupies the space for a very short period of time, and pays the tenant rent. Okay, so what happens is the freehold estate is still kept, but the possession, which is this leasehold estate, is given to a tenant in return for rent. And this is basically how people become very wealthy within real estate, because you're able to do this. You have a property and you actually own it, and you can lease it out to a tenant, and the tenant would be occupying for a certain amount of time. They may leave and bring another tenant in. It gives you what we call cash flow and return on your investments for the property. On top of that, you could have an increase in value of the property over time, which increases your investment more. So this is the key to really to real estate wealth, is how being able to put this leasehold estate in here for what the tenants have. Okay, and so now let's talk about the freehold estate, which is what the landlord, which we call the lessor, we'll talk about a little bit. And then, of course, then we'll talk about the less than freehold estates that the tenant or leasee has. Okay, so freehold estate, there's two major types of freehold estates. Okay, first one is called fee simple. And the second one is called a life estate. Okay, so there's two major types, fee simple and life. Those are the two major types of estates, freehold estates that we have out there. These are the ones that, of course, that the owner has land, the building, all the appurtenances would have, one of these two. Now, fee simple estate, this first type is fee simple absolute. And the second type is called fee simple defeasible. Okay, so fee simple absolute and fee simple defeasible. Okay, these are two different types of fee simple estates. Fee simple absolute is the highest form of ownership that you can get. You can will to your heirs, they can will to their heirs. Right? Since it's the greatest interest that a person can own in land, it's definitely the one that you would want to have on a property. Now, fee simple defeasible can be defeated. Okay, there's a condition on the title that can cause the title to actually be defeated. You actually lose the property. So you buy a property and it says you can use it. You can buy this property, but it says right in the title that you can only use it as a private residence. After you buy the property, you say, you know what, I want to turn it into a board and care facility for handicapped adults. Very noble cause. So you go ahead and you change it over to the board and care facility for handicapped adults. What happens is you just breached, right, this condition. And what happens is the condition on the title is called condition subsequent, something after you buy it. And if you do something that is restricted, you can't do it, right? It's called fee simple defeasible title. Then you can actually lose the property because you changed it to a board and care facility for handicapped adults. It can only be used for a private residence. Now you see that on the exam. Now out in the real world, what happens is you'll see this on a corner of a busy intersection with two different corners, and an oil company owns two corners. They put a convenience store, and then of course they sell all their gasoline on one of them, but they do not want a competitor coming in on of course the other corner. So they'll sell that to somebody, maybe like a fast food restaurant, but they'll sell it and say that this can never be used as a gasoline station or convenience store because they don't want any competition to come in there to what they're doing. Okay, that's when you actually see this out in the real world. On the exam, though, you see the board and care facility for handicapped adults comes up, and that's the one you have to deal with. Okay, so just remember, fee simple absolute, highest form of ownership. Fee simple defeasible could cause a condition that could cause you to lose the property down the road. What happens is that once we open up escrow, we're going to get this thing called a preliminary title report. They call it a prelim. And it comes in, and basically it's an offer by the title insurance company to issue a policy of title insurance for the property. And on there is kind of a laundry list for us. And if we see that in there, instead of saying it says fee title, that little word fee, but if it says something about having a condition subsequent or fee simple defeasible title, then we know we've got a problem on this thing. Okay, and that, of course, you'd have to alert your clients to that effect, and they probably would not go forward and buy the property for that reason. So it's good to know what these are because you'll occasionally see them out there. Definitely see them on the exam. Okay, so this is the fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible. Okay, second one's called a life estate, and give an example here. I'll give you an example of how this works. You have your great aunt Alice. She's a great aunt because she's leaving you a property. Okay. But the thing is that she's giving you a life estate. She didn't give you fee simple absolute title. She gave you a life estate for your lifetime. So when you die, it goes back to Aunt Alice. It does not go to your money-grubbing relatives because she doesn't want her property going to your money-grubbing relatives because she doesn't like them and she likes you. So she says, give you a life estate. You can do whatever you want with the property during your lifetime, but when you die, it goes back to Aunt Alice and does not go to your heirs. Okay, so this is what we call a life estate. And you're probably thinking, well, what happens if Aunt Alice gives it to you and Aunt Alice dies before you do? No problem. It goes to Cousin Carl, who is what we call a remainder person, and that is somebody who she designates and still does not go to your money-grubbing relatives. So that's how she can come back from the grave and make sure that your money-grubbing relatives get nothing, and you get it, and then, of course, whoever she designates after that. So it's called a life estate. You do not see very many of these out there in the real world. Matter of fact, in all the years I've been practicing, I can't really remember seeing this come up anywhere, except on the exam. It comes up on the exam all the time, so you've got to know this. And you never know, you might run into it every once in a while, you know, who knows. But on the exam, definitely. Okay, so make sure you know the difference between those. These are the two major types of freehold estates, which of course is what the landlord, the lessor, would own in the property. Now, what does a tenant have? What kind of leasehold estates or less than freehold estates do they have in the property? Which, remember, isn't much, just possessional. They have 4 different ones we have to know. First one is called an estate for years. And the key thing you have to know is that this does not have to be 4 years. Okay, what this is this is a leasehold estate that starts and it ends. Okay, it might start in 5 years, might start and end in 5 years, might start and end in 2 years, might start and end in 1 year, could start and end in 6 months. 2 months does not have to be for a year. Okay, it's a lease that starts and it ends. You see these very commonly with office buildings and shopping centers and other leased investments that are out there. Okay, so these are very common there, and that's called an estate for years. Okay, just remember, it does not have to be for years. All the questions that come up are usually less than a year, trying to get you to go for the years. So don't get tricked by that. Make sure you realize that it can be any length of time. Now, the second one we have is called an estate from period to period. Okay, estate from period to period, also called a periodic tenancy. Okay, these both, estate from period to period and a periodic tenancy. Now, what this is a month-to-month lease. This is probably one of the ones that you may have maybe experienced in your lifetime, where you rent an apartment building and you pay the rent on, say, January 1st for the month of January, right? And then on February 1st, the rent is due for the month of February. And it goes 30 days, and each time you renew it. And at the end of that tenancy, right at the end of the 30 days, the landlord can give you notice to leave, or the tenant can give notice to leave. The tenant would have to give 30 days notice, right, to leave. And the landlord would be able to give 30 days notice to leave until the tenant's been in there a year. Once they've been in there a year, then the landlord must give 60 days notice. But of course, the tenant can still just give 30 days notice. That's the law in California. So this is a month-to-month type situation. By the way, when the estate for years ends and the tenant stays on paying rent, that converts to an estate from period to period or periodic tenancy. So estate for years would be one that goes and then ends, and then it would convert to this one here, period to period. Now, in this particular type of lease, let's say that it's snowing, you're up in the Sierra Nevada mountains somewhere, it's snowing, your HVAC, heating, ventilating, and air conditioning, of course your heater goes out, right? And so you call up the landlord, hey, I need you to fix this, it's freezing. He says, oh, I'll get to it next week. So you can actually call the HVAC company, have them come out, fix the unit, and deduct it from your rent. You can do that up to 2 times a year, and that's if you have a deadbeat landlord. That's how you can take care of that. So that does happen. It does come up on the exam, or we wouldn't, of course, be covering it, right? Exactly. Okay. Number 3 is called an estate at will, and this one here, either the landlord, who's the lessor, or the tenant, the leasee, can give notice to leave when you're there at will. Okay, so the landlord or the tenant, either one, lessor or leasee, could give notice to leave, and they're at will. You can just tell them to leave. That's the question that you'll see on the exam. Okay, we have number 4, an estate at sufferance. And who's suffering? It's going to be the landlord, because the tenant is in the property and is not paying rent. Okay, so when they're in the property not paying rent, it's tenancy, estate or tenancy at sufferance. Okay, they also use the word tenancy, put it right here, right, at sufferance as well. Okay, so you see that as well. Estate or tenancy at sufferance, they'll use that. And this is one of, of course, as we mentioned, the tenant is in the property not paying rent. Of course, how do you get rid of them? You can't breach the covenant of quiet enjoyment. What you got to do is you have to give them 3-day notice, pay or quit, 3-day pay or quit notice. You need to do an unlawful detainer action and then get a writ of possession from the court and have the sheriff actually physically remove the tenant. So that's how you actually do that if you have this type of an estate and land. Okay, so these are 4 types of estate and land. They're what, of course, the tenant would own. They're only for a very short period of time, right? Possession for a very short period of time. And between the two, of course, which would you rather have? You'd rather have the freehold estate, because that's your highest form of ownership. So it gives us a little bit of an idea on how estates and land work. So let's go ahead and head on over and let's start, see if we can apply some of this stuff. Okay, let's go ahead and see if we can apply some of this information that we've learned on the board. And let's look at freehold estates on the left side. Remember, that's the highest form of ownership. And what happens is freehold estates have three things you have to know. Number one, they're of indefinite duration. It's right there for you. Keeps on going. Of course, a state of inheritance, which can be willed from heirs to the other heirs. And greatest interest a person can own in land. Okay, is that freehold estate. And there are two major types of freehold estates. Right? We have the first one's fee simple, and the other one is called life estate. Okay. So those are the two major types we talked about. So fee simple and life. Okay, let's go ahead and look at fee simple estates. They're also called estates and fee, estates of inheritance, fee estates. These a lot of different names on them on the exam. You see that little word fee, that's what you're looking for. So another name for, well, there's two types of freehold estates. Okay, estate and fee is freehold, first of all. That's underlined for you right there. And another name for a freehold estate is, C as in Charlie, estate and fee. Now, the types of fee simple estates we have, the first one we have is fee simple absolute, which is your highest form of ownership, and there's no conditions on the title. Okay, you own it, you can will to your heirs, they can will to their heirs, no conditions on it. And the other one we have is called the fee simple defeasible title. And what happens with that one is that there's a condition on the title. And matter of fact, we're going to go through a couple of them that come up here that are similar to what we talked about when we were going through the stuff on the board. So let's go on down to the first one. Duke sold his property to Jane with the condition that Jane must never use it for any purpose other than as a private residence. However, after owning the property for several years, Jane decided to start a board and care facility for handicapped adults. What's the status of the estate? A as an alpha may revert to Duke because it's a fee simple defeasible estate. What she said is it has to be used just as a private residence, and since it's now being used as a board and care facility for handicapped adults, that's a condition called condition subsequent, because it's something after you acquire title, you can actually lose the property. We'll go back to when Duke sold it to Jane, back to Duke, so it wouldn't be a good situation for Jane at all. Okay, so that's going to be our first example. And the second one is with alcoholic beverages. So buyer agrees not to sell alcoholic beverages on the property. This condition is included in the deed. The buyer has A as an alpha taken fee simple defeasible title to the property. It says you cannot serve alcoholic beverages on the property. You do so, get caught doing it, and then of course that condition would cause that property to revert back. So that could be a real problem, having a condition on the title. So when you get a preliminary title report that comes in, it'll tell you whether there's a condition on that title in there, and you need to read it very carefully and see if there is. Now, another one we have is called the life estate. That's the second major type of freehold estate, is the life estate. And let's look at three of the practice questions here. So the first one, Abel gives a life estate to Baker for his lifetime. When Baker dies, circle A as an alpha, life estate will revert back to Abel. Because remember, when that when Abel gives the life estate to Baker, for his lifetime, Baker dies, it does not go to Baker's heirs, it will go back to Abel or whoever Abel has specified as the remainder person. So John owns a life estate based upon his own life, right? He leases the property to a tenant for a 5-year lease. We call that the poor unsuspecting tenant, right, on a 5-year lease. John, the life tenant, dies 2 years later. What happens? The lease, B as in boy, the lease is terminated. So when John dies, the lease is terminated, the tenant gets kicked out, and they have no idea it's coming. The good news is we don't have very many life estates out there in the real world. We're going to see most of them is going to be on the exam, okay? But if that happened, the poor person who had rented it is going to have a real problem on their hands because they didn't even see it coming. And which of the following is an example of a freehold estate? C as in Charlie, a life estate. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about less than freehold estates, and then let's look at our little apartment building example here. So with our apartment building, what we're going to do, okay, the apartment building, remember of course the owner, the landlord, right, owns the land, right, everything attached to it and all the appurtenances that go with it. It's considered real property, right? The tenant has possession of this airspace for a very short period of time. It's called a leasehold estate. It is an estate. It is an ownership interest in land, but not much. Because all it is possession of a short period of time. Once it's over, then the landlord will get it back and they can lease it to somebody else. Okay, so that's when we talk about that. Now, see right here we have also called a leasee. So the tenant's also called the leasee. And the landlord's called the lessor. Remember, always the or is doing something to the e. So the lessor, the landlord, leases to the leasee, who's the tenant. Now, if you can't remember that, of course, what you do is you use the or and the e, which you remember is that if you ever have to go to court to evict a non-paying tenant, the landlord will be the lessor of the two. That's how I always remember that. So it's kind of funny, but not funny, you know. Okay, so that's going to be a good example of how those work. So remember, the lessor is the landlord and the leasee is the tenant. Very bottom, it's underlined for you. And the leasehold estate in real property circle is not classified as real property. Why? Because the lease agreement, right? The lease agreement moves, and that's how you remember this, it's personal property. And of course, the freehold estate is real property because it includes the land, everything that's fixed to it, like the house and emoluments and things like that, and then all the appurtenances, right? So that one's going to be real property, it's freehold. But this one is going to be a leasehold estate evidenced by a lease agreement that moves, and it's personal property. That's how you remember those. So a person leased a property for his business activities. Person has what type of lease estate? Estate and land. It's going to be a less than freehold estate. So circle B as in boy. So when you lease something, business or whatever it might be, or residential, doesn't matter, then it's going to be less than freehold estate. Okay, and then let's talk about 4 types of leasehold estates. We have estate for years, estate from period to period called the periodic tenancy. We have the estate at will, and then a tenancy or estate at sufferance. So let's look at the first one, estate for years. And an estate for years can be from July 1st to August 31st, May 1st through July 1st, or October 1st to November 5th. Those are the ones we see on the exam. Just remember, it does not have to be 4 years, right? It starts and it ends. And it could be anything. It could be 2 months, it could be a little over a month. It doesn't have to be a year. That's the key point there. Once you know that, you'll be able to get it right. And a chattel, real, leasehold estate, and estate for years are all personal property. It's underlined for you right there. So a chattel, that of course is personal property. Anytime you see the word chattel. And a leasehold estate, evidenced by a lease agreement that moves. So that's going to be personal property. And an estate for years, which is a lease agreement, which moves, is personal property. So D, all the above. So just got to watch that one a little bit. Okay, so now that we have a little bit on that one, let's look at 3 practice questions here. If a landlord leases a property for exactly 2 months during the summer, this is A as an alpha, estate for years. So that means 2 months. It starts and it ends, does not keep renewing, will be an estate for years, does not have to be years. And then a 7-year lease would be considered, be careful this one because it's D, all the above. Not only is it an estate for years, but it's also personal property and considered a chattel, which is personal property that goes with the land as well. So that'll be D, all the above. So be careful there because A is the right answer, but D is the correct answer because those B and C are correct also. So be real careful because A is the right answer for that question a lot of times. And then sometimes it'll be D, all the above because I'll throw in B and C, which are correct as well. So be real careful, not go too fast. Okay, and let's see here what we got. A leasehold estate lasts for 6 months, was made in advance. What type of estate is it? Circle A as an alpha, estate for years. Again, does not have to be 4 years. Now, the second one we have is the estate from period to period called the periodic tenancy. And the biggest thing on this one here is remember, it's like the month-to-month lease agreement. On January 1st, you pay month for January. Right? February 1st to pay for the month of February, right? And you can give notice to leave if you're the tenant, 30 days notice. If you're a landlord, you give 30 days notice unless they've been in there a year. Then it goes to 60 days notice. And then they have to give 60 days notice on it. Now, the thing is with periodic tenancy, remember, is that let's say that the HVAC system goes out and it's snowing outside. You're up in the mountains somewhere and it's snowing and HVAC goes out. So you don't have any heating, ventilating, or air conditioning, right? So what you do is you call the landlord. They don't fix it, so you go ahead and call an HVAC company. They come out and fix it. Then you deduct that from your rent. Do that up to 2 times a year. And the thing is that you can do that if you have a deadbeat landlord and you're the tenant. Okay, so remember that is one way that you can this falls under the periodic tenancy on the exam questions. Okay, so that's going to be that one. Let's look at estate at will. Now, estate at will, what happens is when a estate for years expires, then a lot of times it will convert over to a periodic tenancy. And that's an estate at will because what happens is the landlord and the tenant, the lessor and the leasee, what can give notice. Either one of them can give notice for the other party to leave. Okay, so it's going to be the estate and continue renting on a month-to-month basis when it expires a lot of times, and that's when you're there at will. And either party can give notice. Remember, with an estate for years, you can't do that because it may be like a 1-year lease or it could be 5-year lease or whatever it might be, and the landlord is stuck with it, and so is the tenant. Whereas the estate at will, either party can give notice to leave. So an estate at will can be ended by the lessor or the leasee, so they can basically say, I'm heading out of town. And then the last one we have of the 4 is an estate or tenancy at sufferance. These both on the exam. And the tenant stays in the property and does not pay rent. Okay, so that's going to be a big one because they stay in the property and they do not pay rent. And of course, what happens, who's going to suffer? The landlord suffers. That's why that's called a estate or tenancy in sufferance. It's the landlord. And so this is one where you have to, of course, go through a formal eviction to evict the non-paying tenant. So a tenancy at sufferance would occur when, circle B as in boy, a tenant remains in the property after expiration of a lease without the owner's consent. And matter of fact, there was a really popular movie called Pacific Heights. Michael Keaton was in there, and he was a tenant in the property, doing everything they could do to mess up the owners, the landlord, in San Francisco, which is really a textbook on what not to do if you're a landlord. Okay, so that's the B as in boy. Then the other one we have is a holdover tenant who stays, does not pay rent, creates B as in boy tenancy at sufferance.